All right. So on the Legion podcast, we've had an ongoing gag, let's say, sort of like some sort of like recurring sitcom joke that, the audience is always clamoring for. They always want us to go off on the whoop. And, we indulge. We often go off on the whoop. We make fun of the data obsession that we see with some athletes and coaches that we think is unhelpful. And we figured we would dedicate a whole episode to just kind of like ranting on some of the misapplications of data collection in training, and then hopefully give some things that we do actually think are useful. So, everyone knows how we feel about the whoop. I think that's not another, we don't need to give the audience what they want here. We don't need to just rant on the whoop. But we do have some other things that we're unhappy with in the broader coaching culture, in the broader competitive CrossFit culture, and we'd like to sound off a little bit. So, Luke, air your grievances. What are your grievances today?
Oh man, it's like every time I go on social media or read certain daily newsletters where a lot of this stuff is advertised, it tends to trigger me. I would say there's definitely a trend right now of people almost trying to, people are data hungry because they want to improve, and people want to, they want to be able to, they want to be able to eke out those marginal gains. But, we also got to consider that a lot of this stuff is only just coming about. And for years and years and years, people have been training and progressing and doing a lot of the stuff that we hope and aspire to be able to do without a lot of this information, without a lot of this this sort of like over analytical way of going about your training. I think that one of the issues that it does create is that people lose they just sort of like lose the ability to understand a bit of nuance. They lose the ability to understand their body, and at the same time, they're becoming over reliant on things that are making promises that I'm not too sure it works that way. One of the things I sort of have seen recently is things like movement screens and sort of movement and mobility applications, which are sort of putting forward the idea of range of motion for range of motion's sake, and are not necessarily taking into consideration the idea of, okay, what actually happens through movement and through human movement. We've done several podcasts on that. It's something that requires an understanding of what's happening through actual flexibility, but then one way you could sort of view it as having sort of the software and the hardware. And I think that a lot of these sort of movement screen applications and this type of stuff where people are testing, yes, it can be useful. I'm not going to deny if it gets someone stretching for 10 minutes a day and they weren't doing that beforehand. I think it's a good thing. But I think if it's sort of making promises of, yeah, you're going to be sitting ass to grass in your overhead squat, whilst you're walking around with a super extended posture, and you're sort of living your life for 24 hours a day, not necessarily helping with the idea of you accessing new range of motion, and maybe they're not necessarily practicing those movements with intention as well. I think sometimes it can sort of just try to compartmentalize things a little bit too much when people don't necessarily pay attention to the bigger picture. So yeah, that's the first one I've chosen to sort of rant on. But it goes down to people over analyzing.
Well, no, let's keep going. Let's keep going on the let's keep going on the movement screening, right? Because I think that's interesting, right? I mean, as someone who has done a lot of continuing education with a lot of like movement-based organizations in the physical therapy sphere or whatever, and has done a lot of movement screens on people, I think there is a decent amount of value in some sort of movement assessment, right? Like that's something that has a place. But I think the application gets skewed, sort of like, as you mentioned, when people turn it into a test that they're trying to pass or whatever, right? So I think that we need to differentiate between what is the purpose of movement screening and then what is the purpose of actually trying to correct some sort of like specific movement problem, right? So to clarify, from my perspective, if we look at a movement screen, that's something that you do up front with not necessarily having information on someone's specific issues or background to kind of get a baseline for where they're potentially at in a way that might change the training decisions you make for them. But this isn't necessarily something that you're going to try to like correct or fix or whatever, right? Because I think that what creates issues is that when you're screening, you're not necessarily screening based upon some sort of like pre-existing problem. You know what I mean? Like there's a huge difference between, giving someone like a full body MRI or whatever to look for things to potentially treat and treating someone who comes to the doctor with a specific symptom where they're like, hey, my shoulder hurts. What's the deal? Right? Because if you give people full body MRIs, you're going to find all kinds of joint degeneration. You're like, oh my God, your shoulder, like it's all messed up. We need to go in there and operate. It's like, actually, I have no shoulder pain. I have no shoulder range of motion issues. And the risks of the surgery potentially outweigh any of the potential benefits that might come. Right. So, when you're screening someone, you're not necessarily going looking for things to treat, because I think that can create some issues on its own. But what you are potentially doing is finding some sort of correlation, right? There is reasonably robust data showing that people who fail certain movement screens are more likely to get certain kinds of injuries. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you can fix someone's movement screen and then reduce their risk of that injury in the future, right? Like that's a big jump and people would like to show that, but I'm not totally convinced that they have. So you're seeing someone who has a potential issue in the future, and you can maybe fix, their toe touch or whatever and be like, great, we fixed you. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you made that person more robust to some sort of like low back injury, right? Maybe they couldn't do the toe touch because they had protective tension, because their subconscious nervous system recognizes that they have a pre-existing disc condition. So it creates tension in the spinal erectors to try to protect that. And then you did some like little voodoo magic and had them breathe in and out of their rib cage, relax the erectors, which then expose the discs and then makes them more likely to get injured, right? I'm not saying that's the case, but maybe that is in fact the case, right? So I think that there's this big issue that comes with misapplication of screening tools as something where you're trying to like, oh, now I need to pass this test. And with a lot of this screening stuff, you're essentially making movement issues potentially legible to people, meaning that they understand exactly where they're deficient according to some standard, and then giving them something that they can then try to fix. And the results of that are not always good, right? It's like, oh yeah, like I think you're using this example where it's like, okay, you're seated and you need to be able to bring your knee up a certain amount to show that you have adequate hip flexion to get into a squat, right? And like that's a reasonable thing to consider. It is a reasonable idea that you need to have motor control over hip flexion in order to get into a squatting position, right? But I would say that there's probably a lot of people who have no issues squatting who can't pass that test. And there's probably a lot of people who do have issues squatting who can pass that test, right? So you need to consider what the actual individual is coming to you as a coach with in order to decide what you want to work on with them. And this idea of just having this like very legible, easily, yes, no binary set of tests that you need to pass. I understand why that's appealing to athletes because they want to get something tangible that they can work on. But I think it's not necessarily appropriate or effective for them, depending on how they're actually approaching it. So that was kind of my rant on movement screening. What say you?
Yeah, like I remember reading sort of on. By the way, my sort of rant earlier wasn't anything against movement screens and all this type of thing. It was just, like you were saying, you don't necessarily want to be chasing ghosts and just going down rabbit holes for the sake of it. You're sort of looking at information to sort of maybe just create some awareness to something that may occur. And there's screening occurs in many other areas of life as well. And I think it does sort of like a similar thing. And I think one of the things I've seen is that people do actually start to get into sort of better behaviors around their movement. They have like a bit of awareness. They start doing stuff just because of the sort of ease of it. Maybe now they're a little bit more knowledgeable of what they need to do. But it also, like I'd give you an example. For me personally, like having like hip flexor issues, I thought that I just needed to stretch my hip flexor, and it was a very, very sort of a simplistic idea, but then that actually made my situation worse, and I was wasting my time for like 18 months just trying to stretch out my hip flexors, and having not stretched them out, I stopped getting a lot of irritation through the hip flexor. And I think that sometimes when people left to the devices of a very simple app that doesn't necessarily know how to just have a conversation with it, or or just they choose that over over going to see a physio or anything like that, who can actually have a look at the situation. That's where you can get into sort of situations like I did, where you just end up wasting a lot of time. I think that there's definitely, even say for example with like nutrition, and you see it with nutrition, when people are like counting their macros through applications and that type of stuff. It doesn't necessarily take into consideration many different factors. You can put in how much sleep you get and the activities that you do and all this type of thing, but it's working off of just basic information. It doesn't necessarily understand the individual and the human, and I think that we've just got to be very careful with how we can use this access to a lot of new different tools now. And I think that we're going back to the movement screen and what that looks like. I think one of the things, I think I saw a meme the other day, and it was of like Klokov doing like an FMS with an overhead squat, and it looking like terrible, based off of the sort of, do this. And then there was another picture of him snatching like 200 kilos and with doing an overhead squat. So that as an example is just sort of showing you, okay, like very much the difference between, what a screen can sort of be telling you, but then also what is actually happening in training as well. And I think as well that sometimes this focus on movement can sort of go down that rabbit hole of, of people, especially people who want to be competitive. They want to be that athlete who's able to do 150 chest bars in an open workout, but they also are like, I need to be completely pain-free. And it's like, that's probably not going to happen. There's certain things that, you're doing to your body which are just not normal. I do remember a physio saying that, like, a lot of people in the clinical world, they would consider doing 100 pull-ups as like trauma on the shoulder, like butterfly pull-ups as trauma is something that you have to obviously build up to over a very long period of time. But what I'm sort of trying to get back to is you've got to be careful with like how you use these tools and the sort of thinking that you could potentially develop from it. What is it you're telling yourself when you're going through all of this sort of work through whatever a mobility app or whatever it is are you telling yourself that you should be pain free and you should be doing this because you're sort of investing this time and this energy into doing this? It's not necessarily the case. And there's always going to be those individuals who are able to go through the training and just not get injured at all and just do crazy things, and then you got those people who will always get injured, and it's like it can be very confusing for an athlete, especially with a lot of the messaging that comes around a lot of these applications, and the very simple do this and this and this and you're going to be okay and you're going to be good, and a lot of the promises that come from a lot of these applications, and things like the Whoop. Sorry, I had to drop it in. But stuff like that. It can it can be very difficult for an athlete to sort of actually navigate of like, okay, what is actually useful, what is actually helpful. And I think one of the things, sort of bring it to something that actually can be useful and can be helpful. When you do look at movement, you can look at things through sort of more of a traditional screening, but then you've got to start to look at how things actually happen when people are moving in their sport and actually happen in training all of the time. What's that technique look like? Are they doing something funky? Are they doing something they actually need to work on? And a lot of the times in those instances, you need a coach's eye and you need correction and you need to change it. You can't pick those things up from an application. You can't pick those things up from from an artificial intelligence sort of viewing your body through like a biomechanical lens. So I think that you can use this information, but at the same time, you've got to understand what the bigger picture is, and you can't just simplify it down to something that's super reductionist, because you're going to end up in hot waters if you're not necessarily clear on what you're actually trying to get, and just sort of going by whatever the marketing is telling you.
Yeah, I think that if we kind of try to extract what we're talking about into just like some principles, the concerns that I think we share with a lot of these like metric driven things that really resonate with the kind of athlete who probably also tends to listen to this podcast, right, is that there's two things that tend to go wrong. One, which is sort of what you're getting at here, is that you're making some sort of complex adaptive system. You're trying to make it legible, right? You're trying to turn it into something that you can look at and reason about without actually understanding like all the details and the nuance of what's going on, right? And I do think some people have the reaction that you have, which is like, hey, like each person is an individual, whatever. And I think that that's not exactly the right criticism of it, because even though each person is an individual, we can still extract patterns, right? There still are things that hold true on average across enough people that it's worth doing, even though every single person is an individual. But that said, there are problems when we try to make something that's complex simple in order to make it legible, meaning that we can actually like look at it and understand it, right? To sort of use like nerdy anarchist academic language from a book called Seeing Like a State, right? I think that that's something that in that criticism of government, trying to make things legible so they can legislate, I think we see a lot of similar issues with coaches and athletes trying to make their movement legible to them by like, oh, can I lift my knee up when I'm sitting down, right? And it's like, well, it's more complicated than that. It's more complex than that, which is totally true. But you understand the impulse of why people want to do that. And I think the thing that becomes really pernicious, though, is when people make these complex things simple and legible, and then they try to optimize for the simple metric, right? Because then that's where the nuance gets lost, and that's where people start chasing their tails, right? And so, again, to use like nerdy language from certain corners of the internet, like people call this Goodharting, right? In reference to Goodhart's law, meaning that people start to chase getting a certain metric, and that when a metric becomes a target, it ceases to become a good metric. This is often seen in a lot of business situations or in a lot of government situations, where if you start to reward people hitting certain numbers, they start to figure out ways to hit those numbers that are not related to the intention of that metric. Right. I mean, I think you can look at the is it Washington Mutual potentially that Warren Buffett, like Berkshire owned a bunch of shares of this company, and they had a metric for opening new accounts, and then sales representatives are just like fraudulently opening tons of accounts under clients' names in order to hit their specific metrics, right? And everyone can sort of think of tons of examples like that. They're all over the internet. And I think you start to see that with things like mobility and movement screening, where people try to make this messy issue of like, why can't I get into my squat snatch legible to themselves by downloading an app that gives them a movement screen. And then they try to optimize for the movement screen, which isn't necessarily going to give them the result that they want and the thing that they're originally chasing, right? So you end up with this like sort of tail chasing situation of making complex systems legible, then Goodharting on an incorrect metric, and people just waste a lot of time. They just waste so much time and energy, and it's frustrating. And, I don't necessarily have a good solution, right? Because as we said before, this idea of like, oh, it's really hard to know anything. Everything is just selection effects. It's impossible. Just trust the experts, but sort of don't. Like that doesn't help. But I think on the margins for people who listen to this podcast, it would be good to be aware of those problems. And for everyone else in the entire fitness world, actually maybe being aware of like, doing some sort of movement screen is probably a good idea because you're just sort of recklessly diving into stuff without having a plan. So I don't know. That's my non-committal take.
Very, very non-committal of you. No, I mean, yeah, I think, yeah, you hit the nail on the head. I think this, you definitely put that a lot more eloquently than I had hoped. And I took down a couple of notes. I have to check out this book, Seeing Like a State. I think
you're going to become an anarchist, Luke.
Don't worry, I'm a little bit. I think
anarchy in the UK, as they say.
Another example of that sort of, people trying to, we were just talking about this before we got on, but the cycle rate of movement in someone's workout, and this is probably going to be a lot more specific to performances and people actually really trying to push for certain performances, but the cycle rate of movements and what does that mean in a workout? What information can you actually extract from that? You can compare elites to people who are not elite. The open is going to be starting to level itself. So I am pretty sure that, the results from the open are going to start to create levels. And I'm pretty sure that you're going to start to see, okay, in like this level, this cycle rate of 22.2 is this. And this level, the cycle rate of da-da-da. So, what type of stuff can people get from that? Is that actually useful information? What was the point you were making earlier, Todd, before we started recording?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the cycle time is in fact useful information, right? That's good to know. And I think we can look at it on a zoomed in level of cycle time of like specific movements, bar facing burpees, double unders, toes to bar, whatever. And then we can also look at it, which we've talked about before on the podcast, with actual split times for rounds, right? And you mentioned the open, you can look at a workout like 22.1, it's a 15-minute AMRAP, like a pretty good score on that is 10 rounds. Like a great score on that is 11 plus, best in the world are getting 12. And you can very easily like calculate what the split time should be in order to hit those numbers, right? You're like, I want to hit 10 rounds on that workout. I need to hit every one round every 90 seconds. Like, okay, cool. And then I think you run into trouble where people are like, oh, okay, now I know my split times, and that's going to then dictate my performance. And, I think the causality is reversed there. It's like these people didn't hit 10 rounds on this workout because they spent 30 seconds to dividing 15 by 10, right? They hit 10 rounds on the workout because they didn't get tired. It's like, well, how do you think this works? Like, it's not like, oh man, like I took 45 seconds and, I did 15 minutes and I divided it by 10. And then there were 30 reps per round. And then I took another 2 minutes and I actually calculated what the cycle time of each rep of my box jump overs needed to be. It's like, that's not why you slow down. You didn't slow down because you didn't take the time to figure out how long a box jump over should take to maintain a 90-second split time. You slowed down because you got fucking tired, and you need to train to not get tired. You don't need to train to, maintain this exact specific split time. So I think that's an area where the causality gets reversed. You get some like weird Goodharting style behavior based upon that as well.
Yeah. I think one of the things that can be helpful with that is say, for example, with bar facing burpees, if you are trying to get your cycle time down to, let's just say like, 2 point something seconds per rep or something like that, I think is something that the sort of elites are holding to for very high volumes. If you extract from that, oh right, I just need to do this in this time and then I'm going to be on this score, and there's not really much thought of like, okay, how is that actually going to look, and you just try to chase a pace, you're going to end up sucking wind halfway through and just being like, this was a bad idea. And I think for anyone who has actually tried to, I think a couple of years ago you put up the open prep video or something like that, where it was like, okay, create a chart, do a pace, like the satirical video on YouTube. If anyone has ever done that, you realize that just doesn't happen. It can give you, maybe if you have like, all right, maybe around this time I want to be on this round or something along those lines, some loose structure of just building a bit of awareness as you're going through the workout. It can be helpful there. One of the things I think can be very helpful is if it sorts people out in terms of their movement economy and they actually sort out their technique because they want to be able to hold better cycle times and that type of stuff. I think that's great. There's nothing worse than, say, someone who's like, well, there's a lot. No, I take that back. There are a lot more worse things. But we can say that from this idea of, analyzing cycle speed, if someone is literally sprinting with the same crappy technique and they're not aware of how they're moving and they're just trying to hold that pace, that's just going to end in a disaster. And you want people to be just aware enough that maybe they need to change how they do it. So let's go to sort of bar facing burpee example. If this gets people stepping up with one foot, sort of approaching the bar at like a little bit of an angle, able to sort of rotate quite quickly, staying low, if they start to train these things, then I think that that might be a good way of using that information. And if, say, for instance, they go and do workouts in the future and they try to, hit that cycle rate and they've changed their technique because of that, I think that's great. But if you've got someone who's just sort of sprinting, they're not really paying much attention to how they can actually go about achieving that cycle rate or improving that, then I think that that's sort of a misapplication of this information. I'll give you one example. For me personally, I wear a Whoop. So for those people watching on YouTube, and the one thing the Whoop has told me is that having one small IPA really affects my sleep and it affects my recovery score. And it's something that I just noticed. And I tried it with nights of heavier drinking, nights of no drinking, and I just noticed that every single time I have like one beer, it affects that. So therefore, I'm a little bit more, you could say, just for me to maintain better recovery and better sleep, I'm a little bit more hesitant to just, finish off my dog walks by going and grabbing a beer at the end. So if that's sort of how, this information can inform how you go about your training, how you go about, all of this stuff that you're measuring, I think that's one way that can be useful. But if you're not making those changes, if you're not actually looking at it from just like what are the easy takeaways here, and if you're just sort of chasing it and going like a full frontal assault on the data and improving and holding yourself to it, then sometimes that can lead yourself into tricky situations.
Yeah, Luke, I think that what you're getting at there is that metrics are valuable. Right? It's important to have some sort of data and to use that to make decisions about what to focus on and how to train, right? And what we're cautioning against is optimizing for the metrics rather than optimizing for what you're actually trying to optimize for, right? So if we use this example of cycle time, split time, whatever, actually analyzing your split times in 22.1 and looking at how consistent were they, when did you drop off, did you have like huge gaps between rounds? What was your cycle time on the box jump overs? Is that why your rounds were slow relative to someone else who got a full round better than you and did the wall climbs and the dumbbell snatches slower, but then was way quicker on the box jump overs, right? Like that can give you useful information, which is like, oh, wow, I was not able to maintain this pace. And the reason I wasn't able to maintain the pace is because I got really, really slow on my box jump overs on rounds 5, 6, and 7. Like that's useful information to know to then help you actually make training decisions, which is how do we improve your resilience to fatigue in box jump overs and high turnover situations, right? Like that's good. That's good information. That's something that you can actually work on, right? But what isn't necessarily going to help is just saying, all right, like I need to attack this workout and need to keep this pace in box jump overs like that. If you just think about it, like rowing pace, right? It's like, oh, I want to row a sub 7 minute 2K. Okay, great. Like I'm just going to get on the erg and I'm going to keep it at 144 the whole time. Like, okay, if you don't have the capacity to row a sub 7 minute 2K, that's not going to work. You're going to get 750 meters in, you're going to fall apart, right? But you can actually have this little nugget of information in your brain of like, I need to be able to maintain this 144 pace at a high, but not like catastrophically taxing effort. Like that gives you information that you can then build towards in creating a training program. So we want to use this information to work on the thing we're actually trying to accomplish and not use it just as like a weird thing that we can optimize for in a way that kind of like disrupts our training and sort of like I was saying before, just results in us chasing our tails where we're, extracting the wrong metric, optimizing for it, and not actually getting anywhere. So that's our rant.